You're watching Captains of Industry here on CNBC Africa. I'm chatting to Leslie Maasdorp, the Vice President of the newly formed BRICS Bank. Leslie, thanks so much for your time. Let's kick off with a little bit about Leslie Maasdorp and the path that has led you to this position, which I'm sure is a highly coveted position among many bankers in South Africa and potentially globally.
Look, I mean, I'd say that my background is a combination of, if you like, organizational, political activism in the formative years of my life, moving on to, if you like, public sector experience, sort of several roles within government, both within the state but also within parastatals. I was chairman of TCTA, for example, which is a water resource infrastructure finance body. And then subsequent to that, 13 years in global investment banks. I think that this role requires a combination of skills and competencies, which I believe I possess to some degree. I think those formative years also in being involved in organization and starting things from scratch is very valuable now. Because remember, Bronwyn, this bank is new. We're literally setting up an institution with a huge capital base of $100 billion, but it is a startup in many respects. We literally have offices starting to set up internet domains, hiring people, setting up procedures, defining our governance rules, and so on.
It's almost as though the planets were aligned when this position became available, because had things worked out at Advitech, you would have been fully deployed as CEO of Advitech and not been available for a vice president role.
One cannot predict events, and there's nothing that is preordained, right? However, I spent a better part of 6 years within the education space. It remains a very exciting space that I watch closely because I'm personally interested in this space, but also because education is one of the central ingredients of what we need to do to put South Africa onto a different trajectory, not just in the short to medium term, but in the long term, right? It's only through massive investment in human capital investment over the next decade and generation, really, that will transform South Africa's prospects, right?
And you've been heavily involved in education, being chairman of Advitech for some 5 years before you took on the CEO
Absolutely.
position.
I think it's important to say, though, that the private sector is but one component of finding solutions to the education crisis, right? Private education is not the solution to what is a deep-seated structural crisis of education and human capital in South Africa. It is one component, one contributor to the overall system. I think the only long-term solution lies in fixing the running of schools, improving governance, getting parents more involved in the running of schools, upgrading the training of teachers, etc., etc. So the whole series of things that needs to be done. But these institutions, Advitech, Kuro, and all of the other private institutions have an important complementary role to play, in my view, especially because they're bringing a fresh and a new dimension, and also, I think, adding in particular this technology component, which is really revolutionizing education, because you can now introduce methods and ways to provide opportunities for learning and accessibility to people who never had the opportunity, for example, to learn at MIT online for free.
We're going to move away from Advitech in a moment and focus on the BRICS Bank, but just to put that to bed, after 4 short months as CEO, you walked away. Were you disappointed at that stage?
Look, I mean, I'd say it was obviously a disappointment. Being CEO for a period of 6 months, it was a very turbulent period, I should say. Currently, the business is also facing some headwinds. I think the underlying fundamentals of the company remain very strong. It's got a very strong management team. It has a path it has carved out for itself. Obviously, right now, there's particular challenges that the company is facing, given that there's become an attractive, if you like, potential acquisition for some of the larger players. And who knows how it's going to unfold. I think, though, that the competitive landscape will continue to increase. More and more players will come into South Africa. There's a number of new startups, for example, in the private education space. So the jury's still out what shape and form Advitech might take.
The BRICS Bank VP position happened very quickly. Take us through the process, because there are two high-profile South Africans that have been seconded to the BRICS Bank, not full-time for Tito Mboweni, who is a non-executive director, and from your perspective, it is going to be a full-time role.
I'm already full-time in the bank. I've spent the last 2 weeks there. I'm in South Africa for a week, and I depart again in about 6 days' time. It is a full-time role, which I'm very excited about. Firstly, to be located in Shanghai, the financial and economic hub and capital of one of the fastest growing economies in the world. China is on a path right now which, you can look at the last 30 years and you can define various sort of moments in the modernization of China's development. But this last year in particular has been very historic. I'll give you a few examples. 9 months ago, China announced the formation of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. This is another 100-odd billion.
Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank.
This is a sister institution to the New Development Bank, but again, it's north of $100 billion capitalization. That bank will mainly be focused on Asia, and China is the dominant player in there. China has set up a whole range of other institutions as part of an elaborate sort of regional integration strategy. There's a broad sort of framework called One Belt, One Road, which China developed a few years ago. And with that initiative, they set up, for example, the Silk Road Fund, which is all about integrating all of the regional sort of economies. So there's clearly a sort of a broader sort of architecture that we as a New Development Bank form part of. And I'm only now beginning to sort of, get a full grasp of the full extent, scope and scale of this institution in relation to the others.
I still want to understand how quickly this happened for you.
Okay.
Did it take you by surprise?
Look, I was nominated to the role. The decision was made by Cabinet over sort of a 6-week period. So, the processes that the Ministry of Finance went through to have the appointment ratified is inside government. But obviously it was a contested role, yeah.
Many are saying that the New Development Bank is going to compete with the World Bank. Is that correct?
Look, I'd say that the New Development Bank at this stage, because we are a new institution, right, I think we're going to be very modest in the objectives, goals and aspirations that we set out there. We do have very ambitious targets. We do have a capital pool that enables us to become a very big player in the development finance architecture. However, we are new. You talk about the World Bank. The World Bank was set up in 1945, so they've got a 70-year head start over us, right? However, there's a power and strength to be new. You can transform your newness into a source of strength. So
you have a nimbleness.
Well, that's exactly right. So one of the things we hope to do is to analyze the business processes, the operational procedures of how the World Bank, Asia Development Bank, Africa Development Bank, how all of these global institutions function to ensure that we are able to improve, learn from the best practices, and to develop what President Kamath, who's the president of New Development Bank, called, we want to define next practices. It's kind of going beyond best practices and defining how you can innovate in 2015 and build an institution of the 21st century. So the first advantage we have is the fact that we are new, right? The second advantage we have is that we can, for example, embrace sustainability, green finance, clean energy in a very different way, whereas other infrastructure finance institutions like the World Bank, Asia Development Bank and so on, sustainability has almost become an add-on. So let's build a coal-fired power station and let's look at technologies which could potentially reduce the carbon emissions, right? We could take a fresh look, and we are likely to take a fresh look.
And leapfrog, that term leapfrog is very popular.
And basically design and construct infrastructure projects in a very different and a new way, embracing also the latest in technology. The president of the bank, David Kamath, and the teams that we are building have a very strong bent on technology. So this is all about kind of tinkering, experimenting, looking at existing models and doing things differently.
For South Africans, it's important to understand that we do belong in the BRICS grouping, that we should be there: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. When we initially were placed in the group, There was a lot of negativity around, is this a token, do we have the gravitas and the might to be part of this emerging market force? What are your thoughts?
Firstly, Africa is an important continent, right? Soon will be 1 billion people, and there's massive infrastructure potential pipeline on the continent. The fact that we are the only African economy within the BRICS formation is therefore significant, right? Secondly, what's very important about the BRICS Bank, or the New Development Bank as we are formally known, which is very distinctive and different from existing and other multilaterals, is that we are formed as an equal partnership, right? So Chinese economy is, I don't know, probably 30 times the size of South Africa, yet we each have equal vote.
Exactly, so it's one country, one vote.
One country, one vote. So essentially, if you look at Asia Development Bank, one of the big sources of tension is the fact that, let's take China. China is twice the size, roughly, of Japan. Yet Japan has a much bigger say in the running of the Asia Development Bank. In fact, Japan and the US have a veto in the Asia Development Bank. Yet China is so much bigger.
No country has a veto in the New Development Bank.
That's exactly right. So in structure, in terms of our governance, we haven't inherited the sort of governance, what are really kind of impediments, or constraints that the World Bank has. And it is true that the formation of the New Development Bank does give, finally, expression and voice, a greater voice to developing countries. Over the last decade or so, during Minister Manuel's time, as Minister of Finance during Minister Pravin Gordhan's time, and now Minister Nene, throughout their periods, I know, having attended the annual meetings of the World Bank, that this tension around a greater role for developing countries have been at the center of the dialogue within the G20, within BRICS when it was formed, etc. Finally now, the developing countries have a bigger voice in the development finance world.
Will the New Development Bank work closely with the World Bank?
Look, I'd say that by definition, we will work with all the other development banks. This is not a kind of a competition who's going to, win a 100 meters race, is Usain Bolt, or this is about filling the financing gap with respect to infrastructure. There's a massive gap globally with regards to the capital for infrastructure, right? So the World Bank has X amount of capitalization. We have 100 billion, as I said, in our bank, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, Asia Development Bank, and so on and so on. All of these combined also just fill a portion of the gap with respect to what the needs out there. So if you look at the needs for ports and upgrading of ports, building of roads, building of power stations, etc., the available capital in the world is significantly below what the needs are.
Let's move now on to the infrastructure mandate, because listening to you, it sounds as though that is where the key focal point is going to be for the New Development Bank.
The first thing to also focus on is the definition of infrastructure, right? What is infrastructure? People typically, when you say the word infrastructure, people visualize a large power station or a major toll road or a dam so people think in those are. However, infrastructure has a much broader definition.
Are we moving on to soft infrastructure?
Yeah. There's also soft infrastructure. For example, if you ask me now, what would be the single biggest intervention in infrastructure that would change the trajectory of Africa?
Well, that has to be the question that I ask you now.
So I would say, firstly, it would be power, right? There's no question that energy, you can't propel an economy forward without energy, right? So if a firm wants to expand, they need, they need power to build a new factory, etc. However, mobile broadband, I think, is going to be, over the next 5 to 10 years, and already, is probably the single biggest lever that is transforming the continent, giving people access to information, right? So that's a form of soft infrastructure, but it is as important in terms of propelling the economy forward, giving people access to information, improving quality of life.
It's going to be, Leslie, then a key balancing act between deployment of capital into soft infrastructure like the digital economy, and then your hard infrastructure, power.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that hard infrastructure obviously will take the bulk of the investment focus. What we will be doing over the next phase of our existence now, over the next, literally the next 2 to 3 months, is develop a project pipeline in each of the 5 BRICS countries. For now, the bank is owned, governed, controlled, and politically directed by the 5 countries. In time to come, it is very likely, and our articles make provision, for the bank to be opened up to new members.
Is the leadership team reflective of the 5 member countries?
So the initial top 5 management team, we come from the 5 countries. We've got the president from India, Mr. KV Kamath, and then we've got 4 vice presidents from the remaining 4 BRICS countries. The rest of the management team will have a very strong bias towards BRICS countries, but we are and will be striving towards merit-based appointments. So, given 2 candidates, one from a BRICS country with similar qualifications as someone from a non-BRICS country, there'll be a bias towards the BRICS country. But we are trying to build, or will build, a multilateral organization filled with talent and the best talent globally.
Is it easy to identify across the BRICS nations that the projects that require fast tracking are very similar in nature? So is power a key impediment to economic growth in Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa?
Despite how diverse our economies are, both in terms of size of population, economic development, and so on, there are a lot of similarities actually between ourselves and Brazil, between South Africa and India. Russia is in a slightly different sort of league, but I think there are a lot of similarities, right? So with respect to hard infrastructure, power is a significant focus in China. It's a significant focus in India, a significant focus here. I therefore would suggest that it's very likely that power would be quite high up in the sort of hierarchy of priorities with respect to the first category of projects that we will finance.
You've been in the position for just a couple of weeks and operating on the ground, so to speak. I'm sure a lot of that has been spent setting up on the ground in Shanghai. What problems do you foresee from the outset? Has anything at this stage caught your eye and really indicated that that is going to have to be something to overcome in the early stages?
I'd say that maybe I'd highlight quickly what's not a problem. What we do have is very strong political commitment from the 5 governments.
The right leadership is in place to steer this organization.
5 countries, from the ministers of finance, the governors of the central bank, the presidencies, we have a full mandate with full authority to establish the bank and move full steam ahead, right? However, there's a certain pace at which you can only implement things, right? Things have a momentum which sometimes you cannot necessarily accelerate. Give you an example. We have to establish policies in our human resource policies to hire people. You cannot hire people overnight, right? You literally have to identify what skills you need. You have to go through a process of soliciting
What you're saying,
CVs.
Leslie, is you're going to have to walk before you can run.
Exactly right. And whilst we've got very ambitious sort of targets, I think we will be slowed down by just the momentum of how you run a new institution, because you've got to make sure that you don't try and speed ahead and make mistakes along the way. However, I think at the same time, we are more than likely, in my view, to also look at co-financing of large projects. So people might now imagine or assume that our first projects would be projects that we identify from scratch, completely new. I think it is more than likely that we would look at existing projects that needs that further impetus, that needs that further capital injection. Exactly. So we will be able to kind of move at different speeds, if you like, and run on parallel tracks, establish the pace of the growth of the organization in an efficient and professional manner, but at the same time accelerate the project pipeline to, by 2016, begin to finance our first
Your initial
project.
term is a 6-year period.
That's right.
What are you hoping to achieve in that 6-year period? Now we're talking about the Leslie Maasdorp legacy.
Look, I'd say that, this is a huge opportunity for me and for South Africa to participate in the establishment of what will be a formidable new global multilateral institution that will exist for the next, decades and decades to come. I think that it's very important for us to find ways in which we can leverage as best as possible this opportunity to maximum benefit to South Africa. I would say, I mean, given that I've been given this unique opportunity, from my own metric of success, I would like to see large numbers of young South Africans being given the opportunity to work globally within this bank. We're going to set up, for example, an Africa Regional Center, which will be a regional headquarters, if you like, a regional office of the bank. I hope to see new young talent coming through, people coming out of universities aspiring to work for the new development bank, because it's innovative, it's young, it's fresh, we want to do things differently, it's green. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to create kind of an employer of choice in the financial services world, and you'll recruit people from wherever they might be, from Merrill Lynch, from Morgan Stanley, to come and work for the new development bank.
We've mentioned that you're going to be based predominantly in Shanghai, but you will have a Johannesburg presence for the New Development Bank. Give me a little bit more insight into the logistics.
So essentially, our mandate as the senior management team of the bank, we will be resident and based in Shanghai, right? Our mandate obviously covers the 5 BRICS countries, and therefore we will spend considerable time in these other countries as well.
So essentially you're going to be living on a plane for the next 6 years?
Well, with a Shanghai sort of bed in the main, yeah. The Africa Regional Center will be a office here that will look at projects not just on the continent. The idea will be when we set up these regional offices that it will also service the bank globally. So the people here might do project identification in South Africa and the region, but they could also be involved in identifying projects and working with teams across jurisdictions in Brazil and in other parts of the world.
How do you see South Africa unfolding now, away from the BRICS scenario?
There's no question that South Africa right now, we face a set of unique economic challenges. I think that our economic growth trajectory is low. We do not have the requirement new investment in gross domestic fixed investment, in other words, new capital formation, whether it's the state or private sector. There's not sufficient investment coming through. We've got a massive problem of unemployment, as you know. We have a significant challenge right now in our commodities sector, which is still a very fundamental tenet of the South African economy. A number of job losses that have just been announced, actually Lonmin and a couple of other firms in the mining industry announcing job losses. So it's very easy to sort of take a very negative, pessimistic sort of view about.
I'm hoping you're going to throw forward to some light at the end of the tunnel here.
You know, the currency is at a 14-year low, etc., etc. So you can go on a kind of almost a self-fulfilling doomsday sort of a scenario. However, I think South Africa still has the ingredients, the possibilities of crafting a different trajectory, right? Firstly, I mean, I'm working obviously a lot more closer now with the government. I'm meeting with people in the Department of Economic Development, Deputy National Treasury and others to understand the scope and scale of the existing infrastructure projects that have been identified. I think with the right focus, with the right sort of application, we could boost further our investment in infrastructure, for example, and the BRICS Bank could potentially play some role in the South African economic landscape as well. However, there's a number of day-to-day, painstaking, just kind of doing things right that we need to focus on. I mean, we spoke about education early on. I mean, it's very clear to me.
Essential to a well-functioning economy.
It's very clear to me that, you know, it's going to be through painstaking, literal interventions, school by school, district by district, that we need to improve our education system to produce the kind of talent for, you know, a sort of knowledge-based economy and a service economy that we're moving towards.
But you are hopeful that we can get there?
Roman, one has to remain hopeful and positive, but informed by concrete set of ideas. It cannot just be hope and sort of, you know, sort of
touchy-feely, airy-fairy
sort of hope.
kind of.
Yeah. I think the reality of the matter still is that the African continent is on a very strong growth trajectory. 6 or 7 out of the top 10 economies in the world, fastest growing economies in the world, are on the continent. More and more South African firms need to shift their lenses outside. As we've got ShopRites and MTN and Vodacoms and so on becoming major players on the continent, as more and more of our South African homegrown multinationals move into the continent and expand their operations there, that have positive multiplier economic benefits for South Africa as a whole. So there's a whole series of possibilities, if you like, right, which requires our focus.
I just want to give our audience a little insight into what the next couple of weeks in your life entails.
Well, firstly, I mean, I've been staying in a hotel in Shanghai up till now, literally, finding a place next week to live, which means setting up sort of roots. We are on an aggressive path to hire talent and hire people. So there are people being seconded, for example, from a number of national development banks in the initial sort of phase. We have signed cooperation agreements with the big national development banks, for example, BNDES in Brazil, Development Bank of Southern Africa here, India Import-Export Bank, and so on, China Development Bank in China. So a whole series of institutions who we met with in Ufa in Russia at the Presidential Summit, and there's a mutual partnership emerging between the BRICS countries and these national development banks to ensure that the NDB becomes a success. So we will be literally going through day-to-day interviews, ensuring that we hire the best people for the roles that we've identified.
Leslie, thanks so much. I've been chatting to Leslie Maasdorp, the Vice President of the New Development Bank. You're watching Captains here on CNBC Africa.